In the spring of 1944, on a training field in southern England, 5 men climbed out of a Sherman tank as fast as they possibly could, while a 6th man stood beside it, holding a wristwatch. Then they climbed back in and did it again. And again. Nobody was shooting at them. Nothing was burning. The engine was cold, the tank was parked, and to anyone driving past on the road, it must have looked faintly ridiculous. Grown men scrambling out of a stationary vehicle over and over while somebody timed them like schoolboys. They were not being ridiculous. They were rehearsing the single most important thing they would ever do. And the clock they were actually racing was much, much shorter than the one on that man's wrist. Today we are going inside the M4 Sherman. Not the armor thickness, not the gun tables, not the endless argument about whether it was a good tank or a bad one. Inside, the temperature, the noise, the air you breathed, the recoil path of a gun breech that swept back through the compartment roughly a foot every time it fired, and the man whose job put his body next to that path. The reason these tanks earned 2 of the ugliest nicknames of the war, and the reason historians now think both of those nicknames may have been invented after the fact. The real cause of the fires, which was not what almost everyone believes. The engineering fix that quietly solved it. And the geometry of 5 hatches, 5 men, and a handful of seconds. Before we go in, if you find this kind of history worth preserving, a like and a subscribe genuinely help this channel more than you know. And tell us in the comments where in the world you're watching from. We're always surprised. Start with the box itself. An M4 Sherman weighed somewhere in the neighborhood of 33 tons, depending on the variant, and roughly 49,000 of them were built. Those are the numbers that end up in books. Here is the number that mattered to the men who crewed them. 5. 5 human bodies inside a fighting compartment that, once you subtract the engine, the transmission, the gun, the ammunition, the radio, the batteries, and the machinery of the turret, left each man a space that was less generous than the front seat of a compact car. And unlike a car, most of what surrounded him was hard, sharp, and moving. 3 men lived in the turret. The commander at the back right, standing or perched on a seat that folded, his head either in the cupola or out of it. The gunner directly in front of him and below, sitting behind the sight, hands on the traverse and elevation controls, effectively wearing the gun. The loader on the left side of the breech, in the only space in the vehicle where a man was expected to move quickly and continuously while everything around him was in motion. 2 men lived in the hull, forward on either side of the transmission housing. The driver on the left, steering with 2 laterals, brake sticks essentially, that took real physical strength on rough ground. And beside him, the assistant driver, the bow gunner, a man who spent his war looking through a periscope at a narrow wedge of the world and firing a .30 caliber machine gun mounted in a ball in the front plate, a weapon so imprecise that crews often described aiming it by watching where the tracers went and correcting with the whole tank. Each of these 5 men wore a helmet, and this is the first detail that tells you what kind of environment this really was. The American tanker's helmet was not a combat helmet. It offered essentially no protection from bullets or shell fragments. It was a leather crash helmet with ventilation holes and padded earphone cups built into the sides for the intercom, and it was manufactured by Rawlings, a sporting goods company, based on the design of a football helmet. The Army did not issue tank crews a football helmet because somebody was being cheap. They issued it because the statistically likely thing to injure a tanker's head on any given day was not the German Army. It was his own tank. Cross a plowed field at speed in 33 tons of steel with no suspension travel to speak of, and you will be thrown against the inside of your own vehicle repeatedly. Men were knocked unconscious by the recoil guard. Men split their scalps open on the gun mount, on the periscope housing, on the edge of a hatch. A tank crossing broken country did not ride. It hammered. The helmet existed to keep you conscious inside your own machine, and that fact alone should reframe everything you think you know about what this job was. Now let the gun fire, The 75mm gun in the standard Sherman turret was not fired at you from outside. It was fired from inside a sealed steel room you were sitting in. And a gun that size in that space is not primarily a weapon in the crew's sensory experience. It is an event. The breech recoils. On the M3 75mm, the recoil stroke was on the order of a foot, and that entire mass swept back into the turret along a fixed path, protected by a recoil guard whose sole purpose was to keep the crew's bodies out of it. Loaders were trained relentlessly to stay clear of that path, to load with the correct hand, to move a specific way. Men who got it wrong got broken arms. The empty case ejected hot into a bag or onto the floor, and the floor of a Sherman turret in a long engagement filled with hot brass that rolled underfoot while the turret rotated beneath the crew's feet. Because in the Sherman, the turret basket turned with the turret, which meant the entire floor the loader was working on was in motion relative to the hull. Then there was the sound. There was no hearing protection in any meaningful sense. The earphone cups in the helmet carried the intercom. They were not designed to attenuate a 75mm gun going off 4 feet away in an enclosed metal volume. Add the engine, a Continental Radial, a Ford V8, twin GM diesels, or the Chrysler Multibank, depending on the variant, running on the other side of a thin bulkhead. Add the tracks, add the ventilator fan. Add 5 men trying to communicate over all of it, with the commander shouting corrections and the gunner answering and the loader calling out what he had just rammed home. Tankers went deaf, not occasionally. As a class, it is one of the quietest long-term costs of the entire armored branch, and it starts here, in a steel box with a cannon in it. And then there was what you breathed. The Sherman's main gun had no bore evacuator. Bore evacuators, the bulge partway along the barrel of nearly every tank gun built since, are what keep propellant gas from venting backward into the crew compartment when the breech opens. The Sherman didn't have one, so every time the loader opened that breech to clear the case, a portion of the burnt propellant gases came back into the turret with him. There was a ventilator. It was not adequate. In a sustained engagement, the turret filled with a haze that men described as choking, eyes streaming, headaches that lasted for hours afterward. The British crews firing cordite-charged ammunition had their own version of the same problem, and the crews learned that firing buttoned up with every hatch closed was a trade. You shut out the fragments and you shut in the gas. Layer heat on top of that. The engine sat behind a bulkhead that was not, by any modern standard, well insulated. In North Africa, in Sicily, in an Italian summer, in the Pacific, a closed-up Sherman under a midday sun became an oven that the crew's own machinery was actively heating from the inside. Men stripped to the waist, men passed out. Dehydration was constant, and in a vehicle where relieving yourself meant either an empty shell case or waiting, drinking enough was its own tactical problem. And then in the winter of 1944, in the Ardennes, the exact same steel box became a refrigerator. 33 tons of metal is a magnificent heat sink. Crews slept under their tanks rather than in them, dug into the earth beside the hull because the ground was warmer than the machine. And through all of it, a crew did not commute to this. They lived on it. They ate off the back deck, dried socks on the engine grating, stowed their bedrolls and their rations, and everything they owned in boxes bolted to the outside of the hull, and slept within arm's reach of the vehicle so they could be moving in under a minute. The interior developed a smell that veterans have described the same way for 80 years. Hot oil, gasoline, grease, burnt propellant, and 5 unwashed men. And the smell did not come out of a man's clothes for as long as he crewed the thing. You could identify a tanker in a rear area without looking at his shoulder patch. They were not passengers in a weapon system. They were residents. Now consider what you could actually see. Buttoned up, the driver's world was a periscope. So was the bow gunner's. The gunner looked through a telescopic sight with a field of view so narrow that finding a target he had been told about, in a hedgerow, in a tree line, 300 yards away, could take agonizing seconds while the commander shouted directions from above. Which is exactly why tank commanders rode with their heads out of the hatch. Every commander knew what that cost. Head out, you're exposed from the chest up to small arms, to airburst fragments, to snipers who understood perfectly well what a man in a cupola was worth. Head in, you are safe from all of that and functionally blind, moving a 33-ton vehicle through terrain you cannot see, toward an enemy you cannot find, with the men in the hull utterly dependent on your eyes. They rode with their heads out, almost all of them, almost all the time. Tank commanders took casualties out of proportion to the rest of the crew for exactly that reason, and they did it knowingly, day after day, because the alternative was to get everyone killed while safely buttoned up. Which brings us to the fires. And to the two words that have defined the Sherman's reputation for 80 years. You have heard them. The Ronson, after the cigarette lighter whose advertising promised it lit, first time, every time. And the Tommy Cooker, supposedly what the Germans called it, a grim joke about a British trench stove. Here is the part that almost never gets told. Both nicknames are, at minimum, contested, and there is a serious argument that neither of them was in common use during the war at all. The armor historian Nicholas Moran, who has done more archival digging on this specific question than almost anyone, has pointed out a straightforward problem with the Ronson story. The advertising slogan people attribute it to does not line up cleanly with the wartime period, and contemporary wartime documents and veteran accounts are remarkably thin on the nickname itself. It appears to grow in popularity long after the war, in books and documentaries, until it becomes something everyone knows and almost nobody can source. Tommy Cooker has a similar problem. The term existed, but its route to becoming a German nickname for the Sherman specifically is far murkier than the confident retellings suggest. So why does this matter? Because the nickname carries an explanation inside it, and the explanation is wrong. Everyone who repeats Ronson is also repeating a theory, that the Sherman burned because it ran on gasoline, while German tanks ran on diesel. It is one of the most durable pieces of misinformation in popular military history. And it is false in both directions. German tanks, the Panzer IV, the Panther, the Tiger, ran on gasoline too. And more importantly, gasoline was not what was killing Sherman crews. Wartime investigators worked this out through the least glamorous method imaginable. They went out to knocked out tanks and took them apart. British operational research teams in Normandy and American ordnance investigators doing parallel work examined penetrated tanks methodically, where the round entered, what it hit, whether the vehicle burned, and what the burn pattern indicated. And the answer they kept arriving at was ammunition, not the fuel tanks, the propellant in the main gun rounds. Now here is why the geometry mattered. On early Shermans, main gun ammunition was stowed in the sponsons, the boxed-in spaces above the tracks, running along both sides of the hull. That is a sensible place to put ammunition if your priority is getting it into the loader's hands quickly. It is a catastrophic place to put it if your priority is not being hit, because the side of a tank is, statistically, what gets hit. A round punches through the side armor. It has to pass through the sponson to reach anything else. It hits stowed propellant. And propellant does not explode the way people imagine. It burns ferociously, generating enormous volumes of flame and gas almost instantly in a compartment containing 5 men. And this is the chemistry that makes the gasoline myth not just wrong, but backwards. Gasoline is dangerous because of its vapor. Liquid gasoline needs to evaporate and mix with air in the right proportion before it will light, and it needs that air to keep burning. Smother it, and it goes out. Gun propellant does not work that way at all. Nitrocellulose-based propellant carries its own oxidizer inside the chemistry of the material itself. It does not need the air in the compartment. It cannot be smothered. Set it going, and it will burn at its own pace, regardless of what you do to the atmosphere around it, which is precisely the property that makes it useful for throwing a shell out of a barrel, and precisely the property that makes a few dozen rounds of it a nightmare inside a sealed steel room. So a fuel fire in a tank is survivable more often than people assume. An ammunition fire is not something you fight. It is something you leave. Once the Army understood this, the fixes came in stages, and you can read the panic in them. First, the crude one, applique armor. Slabs of extra steel welded onto the hull sides, on the outside, directly over the ammunition racks. If you have ever looked at photographs of Shermans and noticed rectangular patches bolted or welded to the side of the hull, that is what you are looking at. It is a factory-applied admission that they knew exactly where the problem was. Then the real one, wet stowage. Engineers moved the ammunition out of the sponsons entirely and down into the hull floor, below the turret basket, the lowest, most protected volume in the vehicle. And they surrounded the racks with jacketed containers of water mixed with antifreeze and a corrosion inhibitor. The theory was simple. If a fragment breaches a round, the liquid floods the area and either prevents ignition or smothers it before it propagates to the rest of the load. Tanks built this way carried a W in their designation, and the results in the figures most commonly cited from the ordnance studies were dramatic. Dry stowage Shermans that were penetrated burned in something on the order of 60 to 80% of cases. Wet stowage Shermans penetrated burned in roughly 10 to 15%. Sit with that for a second. That is the same tank, the same crew, the same enemy gun, and a difference in survival that came down entirely to where somebody decided to put the ammunition and what they decided to put around it. The men who had already burned did not get the benefit of that lesson. They paid for it. So let's go back to those 5 men on the training field with the stopwatch. Here is why they were doing it. You are the loader. You are in the left side of the turret, standing, and the tank has just been hit. You did not hear a warning. There is no warning. There is a bang that is not like any other bang, and a spray of hot metal, and then the compartment starts filling with light. You have seconds, not a minute, not 30 seconds. Accounts from men who lived through it describe a propellant fire filling a fighting compartment faster than a person can reason about it. You either move on reflex, on drill, on the thing your body learned on a training field in England, or you do not move at all. And notice what your body has to do in those seconds. You are standing on a floor that rotates. There is hot brass rolling under your boots. Your intercom cord is plugged into the helmet on your head, and if you go up without unplugging it or ripping it loose, it will stop you at the shoulders. The man whose exit you are waiting on is above you, and he is wearing the same equipment and solving the same problem. In front of you is the breech of the gun and the recoil guard, and the fastest route out is not the shortest one. It is the one you rehearsed in order with the same 3 men until your hands stopped asking your brain for permission. That is what the stopwatch was for, not speed, sequence. Now count the hatches. In the turret of an early Sherman there was one. One hatch in the commander's cupola for 3 men. The commander, the gunner, and the loader all had to go through the same hole in order with a fire behind them. The Army eventually added a second turret hatch on the loader's side, and if you want a single detail that captures how this war was actually fought, it is that a design change giving 2 men their own exit instead of queuing for one was an improvement that had to be identified, argued, approved, tooled, and shipped, while crews in the field waited. Down in the hull it was no better. The driver and the bow gunner each had a hatch directly above them in the front plate. On early hulls those hatches were small, and, critically, they could be blocked by the turret. If the gun was traversed over the front of the hull, the driver's hatch would not open, which means the driver's ability to escape a burning tank depended on where somebody else had left the turret pointing. Crews developed the habit, before anything else, of getting the gun back to the 12 o'clock position, and gunners knew exactly why they were being told to do it. Later, hulls got larger hatches and a better arrangement. There was also, on most Shermans, a small escape hatch in the belly of the hull behind the assistant driver, which crews used to get out of a tank they could not exit from the top, and used more than once, to drag wounded men out of the underside while machine gun fire went over the deck. Because that was the other half of it. Getting out was not the end of the problem. German infantry and machine gun crews understood perfectly well that a burning tank produces men, and they laid their fire accordingly. Crews came out of the hatches into that. Some crews came out on the far side and crawled. Some came out and went straight back in because a man was still inside. And the burns. The exposed skin on a tanker was his hands and his face, hands on controls, hands on ammunition, face at a sight or a periscope. So that is where the burns concentrated. Tankers' burns were common enough to become a recognized pattern in Allied field medicine. Men who survived the fire carried it, visibly, for the rest of their lives. Here is the part that most people get wrong in the other direction, and it deserves saying plainly, because this channel deals in what the records actually show rather than what makes the better story. Most Sherman crewmen who were knocked out survived it. The operational research done on knocked-out tanks in Normandy pointed to something that surprised people then and still surprises people now. On average, a Sherman that was destroyed cost the lives of roughly 1 man out of the 5. That is 1 man too many, every single time. But it is not the death trap of legend, where a hit meant a crew. It reflects exactly the things we have just walked through: hatches, drills, escape routes, the belly hatch, and the fact that crews rehearsed getting out until the movement stopped requiring a decision. The stopwatch on that training field saved lives. That is the whole point, and the crews did not wait for the Ordnance Department to solve their problems for them. This is the part that belongs in a footlocker. Crews welded spare track links to the front plate and the turret face, laid sandbags across the glacis, bolted on plate, cut from other tanks that were past saving. Some units did it systematically. One armored division ran field programs to armor their own vehicles with steel salvaged from knocked-out hulls. Some of it worked. Much of it didn't. Third Army ran tests on sandbags and came away distinctly unimpressed, and the added weight punished the suspension and the final drives, which crews then had to maintain themselves in the mud. But you have to understand why men do this. When you cannot control the gun that is going to be pointed at you, you control the thing in front of you. You weld, you stack, you rehearse the bailout one more time. It is the same instinct that put a football helmet on a tanker's head, and the same instinct that eventually moved the ammunition to the floor of the hull. One last thing, and then we will close. A tank that burned did not disappear. It sat where it stopped, sometimes for days, and eventually someone had to go and deal with it. Recovery crews, ordnance maintenance men, and the Graves registration soldiers whose job it was to bring out whatever the fire had left. Those men were not in the tank. They are almost never in the story. They saw the inside of more knocked-out Shermans than any tanker ever did, and it is a piece of this war that we will come back to because it deserves its own file. Go back to that field in England in the spring of 1944 and the man with the wristwatch. He was not timing a drill. He was measuring the distance between a design decision made in a factory in Detroit and a 19-year-old's chances of climbing out of a hole in the top of a turret. Every second they shaved off was a second bought back from the geometry. The ammunition in the sponsons, the single hatch, the gun left traversed over the driver's head. The Sherman was not a death trap, and it was not a fine place to be. It was a workplace with a cannon in it, hot in summer, freezing in winter, deafening always, breathing its own gun gas, hammering its crew against its own interior, and capable, until somebody moved the ammunition, of turning into a furnace with the men still inside. They knew all of it. They got in anyway, 400, 500, 1,000 times, and most of them got out again because they had practiced. If you crewed armor, Shermans, or anything since, this is exactly the kind of thing that belongs in the record before it's lost. And I want to ask you something specific. What was your crew's bailout order, and who came out of which hatch? Every outfit had its own drill, its own rules, its own superstition about where the gun got parked. The best story in these comments becomes a future file. That is not a figure of speech. It is how several of the videos on this channel got made. If this file was worth your time, leave a like. It pushes this story in front of more people who will care about it. Share it, because this history is too strange and too human to stay buried. And subscribe for more of what they didn't put in the textbooks. To the men who climbed into a steel box, closed the hatch behind them, and did it again the next morning. This one was for you.